All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. You know why you're here. You want the knowledge. Like you want to get to the bottom of things, quickly and just really thoroughly without having to wade through a bunch of fluff. So today we are going to be diving deep. No surprise there.
And we're tackling a pretty crucial area today. We're going to be looking at how we as a global society, how we feel about climate change.
Yeah, and we're not just talking about general anxiety here. We're talking about the full spectrum of emotions and how they might actually be influencing the way we approach solutions. Specifically, those technological solutions that are being proposed.
Right. And we're fortunate to have some really, really rich material to draw from for this deep dive. A recent global study, they surveyed over 30,000 people.
30,000, wow.
30,000 people, yeah, across 30 different countries.
Okay, so we're talking global here. This isn't just, it's a small regional study.
Absolutely not. This is a global perspective. And what they did was they really dug into people's feelings, about climate change, obviously, but also their views on some of the pretty advanced climate technologies that are, being talked about and developed right now.
So you've got like carbon capture, you've got, things like solar radiation management, all that good stuff.
Yeah, the stuff that's both promising and potentially, a little bit scary. And, so that's what we're diving into today.
Okay, so let's lay out, what's the mission for today's deep dive? What are we really trying to understand here?
So our goal is to really kind of map out this global emotional landscape of climate change. What are the feelings? Which ones are most prevalent around the world? How do they differ from place to place?
And how do those feelings then connect with what people think about these different technologies designed to try to address the problem?
Right, because ultimately we need solutions, and understanding how people feel about those solutions is going to be crucial to actually getting them implemented.
Absolutely. Okay, so emotion and action, that's the thread we're pulling on today.
Yeah. And we also want to look at whether just learning about these technologies, can it even shift how people feel?
Oh, that's an interesting angle. So, if you learn about carbon capture, do you suddenly become, more hopeful? Or if you learn about geoengineering, does it make you more anxious?
Right, exactly. Can information itself influence those emotions? We're hoping to find some surprising connections here, some aha moments for you. So let's dive in.
Okay, let's do it. So first things first, what's the overall emotional vibe when it comes to climate change, worldwide?
So the study, they looked at 5 core emotions, fear, hope, anger, sadness, and worry. And what they found was across all the people they surveyed, worry emerged as the most commonly reported emotion.
Okay. So worry is the baseline, the background hum.
Yeah, the underlying current. That makes sense to me. It's not necessarily panic for most people, but just this persistent concern.
Persistent, yeah. Okay, so worry. Then what? What were the other big ones?
So following worry, we had sadness, then fear, then anger, and then hope. Actually, hope was the least commonly reported of those 5.
Really? So less hope than anger even.
Yeah, that's right. But it's important to note that the vast majority of people, no matter where they lived, they reported feeling at least somewhat worried about climate change.
Okay, so worry is that's the unifying emotion.
Yeah. Seems to be a global experience.
And you mentioned that these feelings kind of cluster together, right? It's not just I'm worried, but I'm also hopeful. They tend to go together in certain ways.
Right, exactly. It's not just a random assortment of feelings. There are patterns here. So what they found was that the negative emotions, so anger, fear, sadness, and worry, they tend to be positively correlated.
Meaning, if you're feeling one strongly, you're more likely to feel the other strongly as well.
Exactly. So if someone is really angry about climate change, they're also more likely to be feeling, fearful, sad, and worried.
Okay. That makes sense. Now, what about hope? Does that kind of fit into that same pattern?
Hope is interesting. It plays a bit of a different role. It was actually negatively correlated with anger and sadness.
So more hope, less anger and sadness.
Yeah. Suggesting that, if people are feeling hopeful, maybe they're able to manage those feelings of anger and sadness a bit better.
Interesting. And maybe that has something to do with feeling like there's a path forward.
Yeah, possibly. Now, intriguingly, hope had a slight positive link with worry, but no real connection with fear.
So you could be hopeful and worried at the same time.
Seems like it. Yeah, it's not just hope is the opposite of all the negative feelings. It's more nuanced than that.
So it's not just a simple spectrum of, despair on one end and hope on the other. It's more complex than that.
Much more complex.
Okay, so we've got a sense of kind of like the overall global picture. Now remember, this was a study across 30 countries. So did they find that these emotions were felt equally everywhere? Or were there some pretty significant differences based on, where people lived?
Oh, there were definitely some substantial differences across the 30 countries. Let's start by looking at hope, for example. The study found that people living in developing economies in the global south.
So those are often, countries that might have less industrialization, maybe more directly impacted by some of the effects of climate change already.
Right, exactly. So those countries, as well as what are known as the basic countries, that's Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, and other emerging economies, they generally expressed higher levels of hope about climate change.
That's fascinating. You'd almost think that people in more developed nations, the ones with more resources, more technology, that they might feel more optimistic about, being able to tackle the problem.
Yeah, you might expect that, but that wasn't really what the study found. In fact, it was quite the opposite.
So who are the most hopeful? Like, which countries really stood out?
So countries like Indonesia, Nigeria, and India were among the most hopeful.
Okay, interesting. So now on the flip side, if those were the most hopeful, who are the least hopeful?
So in contrast to that, a lot of Western and Northern European countries like Germany, Austria, and Sweden, for instance, they reported much lower levels of hope.
Wow. Okay, so there's a real kind of divide there, and it's not necessarily the one you might expect.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's worth, digging into why that might be, but we'll come back to that maybe.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've talked about hope. Now, what about some of those other emotions, like anger and sadness? Where did those feelings tend to be more prevalent?
So anger and sadness tended to be more common in countries that are, more directly exposed to and vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So that makes sense, right?
It does. If you're already experiencing, more frequent extreme weather events or, rising sea levels, things like that, it would stand to reason that those feelings of anger and sadness about what's happening are going to be stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. So Southern European countries, places like Spain, Italy, and Greece, they showed higher levels of anger and sadness, along with some emerging economies like Chile, Turkey, Indonesia, India, and Brazil.
Okay. So those are countries where climate change is really starting to hit home.
It is. And on the other hand, some Northern European countries, along with the U.S. and the Netherlands, reported lower levels of those emotions.
Okay, so it's kind of like a vulnerability factor almost.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Like the more vulnerable you feel, the stronger those emotions are likely to be.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about fear and worry? Did they follow a similar pattern?
Not exactly. So for fear and worry, more advanced economies in the global north, particularly Scandinavian countries, Estonia, Poland, and the Netherlands, reported lower levels.
Okay. So those are countries that, generally speaking, have more resources, more infrastructure.
Right. Maybe they feel like they're a bit more insulated, at least for now.
Maybe. Yeah. It's interesting though, because you think about some of those Scandinavian countries, they're very progressive when it comes to climate action. So you might think that, concern and worry would be higher.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not just about vulnerability. It's also about, cultural attitudes, political priorities. It's complex.
Right. And then who are the most fearful and worried?
Brazil stood out as having the highest levels of both fear and worry.
Wow. Okay.
Followed by other basic and emerging economies. Developing economies like the Dominican Republic and Kenya, and then again, those Southern European nations we talked about.
Okay, so it's interesting. It's like there's a real kind of split, I guess, in the emotional response.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to correlate, at least to some extent, with a country's level of economic development.
Yeah.
But also, like you said, their exposure to those climate impacts.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. Like if we were to try and kind of draw some broader conclusions based on the level of economic development, developing countries generally reported the most hope, but less anger compared to other groups.
Okay.
Makes sense. Advanced economies, so those with higher levels of industrialization, reported the least hope, fear, sadness, and worry, although their level of sadness was similar to that in developing economies.
Okay. Interesting. And then where do the emerging economies fit in?
Emerging economies tended to express the strongest negative emotions overall, so kind of like a mixed bag there.
A bit of everything. Yeah. Okay. So that gives us a really good overview of how climate change is kind of felt differently around the world. Now, the study didn't just look at these emotions in isolation. They also examined how those feelings might influence people's views on the potential technological solutions out there.
Yeah, the whole point is we need solutions. So understanding how people feel about those solutions, it's key.
Absolutely. So let's get into that. Let's talk about the relationship between these emotions and support for different climate intervention technologies. But before we do, just a quick reminder, can you kind of walk us through, what are those technologies, just to make sure everyone's on the same page?
Sure. So the study categorized climate intervention into two main approaches. There's carbon dioxide removal, that's CDR, and then there's solar radiation modification, which is SRM.
Okay, so CDR is all about sucking that CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, exactly. Like trying to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are already up there.
And SRM is more about reflecting sunlight away from the earth to try and cool things down.
Exactly. So it's not addressing the root cause, but it's trying to, mitigate the effects.
Okay, so two very different approaches. And then within those two categories, there are different types of technologies, right?
Right. So within CDR, they looked at ecosystems-based methods, things like afforestation, which is basically just planting trees.
Good old-fashioned tree plant.
Yeah, exactly. And then they looked at engineered CDR technologies, like direct air capture. That uses machines to remove CO2 directly from the air.
Okay, so that's getting a little bit more high-tech.
Definitely. And then for SRM, an example they looked at was stratospheric aerosol injection. So that involves, spraying tiny particles into the upper atmosphere to reflect sunlight.
Okay, so that's the one that kind of makes people nervous.
It can. It's definitely got some potential risks associated with it.
Right, for sure. Okay, so we've got our technologies laid out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how did people's feelings about climate change, how did that relate to whether they supported these different technologies?
So one of the most fascinating things here was that hope and worry seem to be very consistent drivers of support for almost all of the climate intervention options. So higher levels of both hope and worry were linked to greater support for both CDR and SRM technologies.
That's interesting. So you can be hopeful about the future and worried about the present, and that kind of pushes you towards wanting to see these solutions implemented.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like hope makes you complacent or worry makes you reject everything. It seems like they both can motivate action.
Interesting. Now, were there any exceptions to that pattern?
Yeah, there were a couple of exceptions. So hope didn't have significant connection with support for afforestation.
Really? That's kind of surprising. You'd think, planting trees, that feels very helpful.
You would. And worry had the weakest effect on support for afforestation as well.
Huh. Okay, so maybe there's something about that specific type of solution, like planting trees, it's seen as more familiar, less high-tech, less kind of drastic, maybe.
Yeah, that's possible. It's like, maybe it's seen as too small scale, or maybe it's not seen as a real technological solution.
Right. Okay, so that's hope and worry. What about fear?
So they found that feeling afraid was positively linked to support for SRM and engineered CDR, but not ecosystems-based CDR.
Okay, so the scarier technologies, the more high-tech ones, if you're fearful, you're more likely to support those.
It seems like it, yeah. So maybe, when people are more afraid, they're willing to consider the riskier or more technologically intensive option.
Yeah, it's like, well, we're in a tough spot, so let's pull out the big guns.
Right. Okay. And then anger showed a bit of a different pattern. So when anger was a significant factor, it actually had a negative relationship with support.
Really? That's surprising. You would think that, if people are angry about climate change, they'd be more inclined to support any potential solution.
You would, but it seems like it's a little more nuanced than that. Specifically, anger had a negative relationship with support for ecosystems-based CDR, and also BECCS, that's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and biochar, which is another type of CDR.
Okay, so all of those they're kind of, they involve using plants and trees and things like that.
Yeah, they're more nature-based.
Okay, so why would anger be negatively correlated with those?
So the researchers, they speculate that maybe, anger being an emotion that's often directed outwards, like you're angry at someone or something, it might lead people to view these land-based solutions as insufficient.
Like it's not enough.
Yeah, like it's not addressing the root cause. Or maybe even, it's seen as a way to avoid addressing the root cause.
Like a distraction almost.
Right. Like we should be focusing on, reducing emissions, not just planting trees.
Okay. That's an interesting take. Now, what about sadness? How did that emotion play into people's views on these technologies?
So sadness was the most complex. It was positively linked to support for ecosystems-based CDR and biochar, but negatively linked to space-based geoengineering.
Okay, so sadness is like the one emotion that kind of cuts both ways.
Yeah, it's the only one in the study that had both positive and negative associations.
Interesting. So maybe there's something about, with the ecosystems-based solutions, maybe there's a sense of wanting to protect or restore something that's perceived as being lost or damaged.
Yeah, possibly. Like there's a grief there, and these solutions feel like a way to kind of heal that.
Okay, and then with the space-based geoengineering, maybe there's a feeling that it's too detached from the natural world, or maybe even a bit dystopian.
Yeah, like it's a technological fix that doesn't really address the emotional root of the problem.
Right. Okay. So if we were to kind of summarize the overall trends by technology category, what would you say?
So hope, fear, and worry generally boosted support for SRM and engineered CDR.
Okay. So those are the ones that are seen as more drastic, more high tech.
Yeah, exactly. Fear wasn't a significant factor for ecosystems-based CDR, while sadness was positive for this category and anger was negative.
Okay. So it's not as simple as just being concerned about climate change leading to blanket support for all solutions.
No, definitely not.
The specific emotion a person feels and the type of technology being proposed, those both matter.
They're both key factors in shaping that support.
Okay. Now, the study also looked at how these emotions influenced people's perceptions of the risks and benefits associated with these technologies, right?
Yeah, that's right. They wanted to understand not just whether people supported them, but also how they viewed them.
And were those findings similar to what you just described about support?
Interestingly, the link between emotions and how people perceived the balance of risks and benefits was actually weaker than the link with support.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So it's almost like, our emotions play a more direct role in whether we're like for or against a technology than in how we rationally assess its potential pros and cons.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Like our gut reaction is driven more by emotion, but then when we actually start to think about the specifics, maybe we become a little more rational.
Possibly. And there were even some surprising reversals. For example, anger had a positive link with how beneficial people perceived enhanced weathering to be.
Now, remind me, what is enhanced weathering again?
So that's a type of CDR where you basically spread crushed rock over land to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere.
Okay. And you said anger was positively correlated with the benefits of that.
Yeah. Which is kind of the opposite of its negative link with support for some other CDR methods.
Okay, that's interesting. What about sadness?
So sadness was negatively linked to the perceived benefits of several technologies, including SRM approaches like stratospheric aerosol injection and space-based geoengineering, and also enhanced weathering.
So even if someone is feeling sad about climate change, they might not necessarily see the upside of certain solutions.
Yeah, exactly. And then, perhaps surprisingly, hope was no longer significantly linked to how beneficial people perceived some ecosystems-based CDR to be.
Oh, really? So even if you're hopeful, you might still have reservations about planting trees or other nature-based solutions.
Yeah. It's like hope isn't a guarantee of seeing everything through rose-colored glasses.
Right. Okay. And what about worry?
Worry also wasn't a significant factor in how people weighed the risks and benefits of several CDR options. So it seems like worry kind of plays out more in terms of just general support or opposition rather than specific perceptions of risks and benefits.
Okay, that's really fascinating. So it's complicated.
It is. Human emotions are complex.
Yeah, no kidding. Now, finally, the study also explored whether just learning about these technologies could actually have an impact on how people felt about climate change.
Right. This was the quasi-experimental part of the study.
Yeah, so they actually they kind of tested this out, right?
They did. So what they did was they randomly gave participants information about one of the three technology categories we discussed: ecosystems-based CDR, engineered CDR, or SRM. And then they looked to see if receiving this information had any measurable effect on the participants' reported climate emotions.
So they were basically trying to see if learning about solutions could shift how people felt about the problem itself.
Exactly.
Okay, and what did they find? Like, did learning about carbon capture make people feel more hopeful, or did hearing about geoengineering, increase their anxiety?
So the most notable finding here was in relation to hope.
Okay, tell me about hope.
Reading about ecosystems-based CDR, things like planting forests, actually increased people's feelings of hope about climate change more than learning about the other types of technologies.
Really? So learning about nature-based solutions made people more hopeful?
Yeah, it seems like it. On the other hand, reading about SRM, so those solar radiation modification techniques, led to the biggest decrease in hope.
Okay, so more trees, more hope. More geoengineering, less hope.
Yeah, that's kind of the takeaway there. The difference in hope levels between those who learned about engineered CDR and those who learned about SRM was also statistically significant.
Okay, so even engineered solutions like carbon capture and stuff, those were seen as more hopeful than the geoengineering stuff.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so that's really telling. It seems like, the type of solution that we're talking about, the way we frame it, that can actually influence how hopeful people feel about the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And the researchers suggested that the increase in hope around ecosystems-based CDR might be because those solutions feel more tangible.
Yeah, like more in line with natural processes. Like we understand how trees work.
Right, exactly. And maybe easier to envision as effective solutions. Whereas the decrease in hope after reading about SRM could be due to the perceived risks associated with those technologies.
Right, or just the feeling that, we're resorting to very drastic measures, which might signal that the situation is even more dire than we thought.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. What about the other emotions? Did learning about these technologies have any significant impact on worry, fear, anger, or sadness?
So for worry, there were some initial differences in levels depending on which technology category people read about, but these differences weren't statistically robust after the researchers applied some controls.
Okay, so worry was kind of all over the place.
Yeah, a bit more muddled. And for fear, anger, and sadness, they didn't find any significant impact based on the technology information the participants received.
Okay, so hope was really the main emotion that was shifted by learning about these things.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Okay, so the effect wasn't huge across the board, but it does suggest that the way we talk about climate solutions, the ones we focus on, that can subtly influence how hopeful people feel.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that matters, right? Because hope it's a powerful motivator.
It is. It can drive action.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. This has been a really insightful look at the emotional side of climate change.
Right.
And how it connects with potential solutions.
Huh.
So as we wrap up, what are the key things you think our listeners should really take away from this deep dive?
Okay, so if I had to boil it down, I'd say there are 4 really important points. First, our emotions about climate change are very real, and they vary significantly around the world, often reflecting a country's economic situation and how directly they're experiencing climate impacts.
Okay, so where you live, how you live, that shapes how you feel.
Right. Second, hope and worry. They're both powerful forces when it comes to whether people support climate intervention technologies.
So both the positive and the negative can be motivating.
Yeah. Third, the specific type of technology being discussed and the emotions that people associate with it, those are both really important factors in building public support.
So we need to be mindful of the emotional landscape when we're talking about solutions.
Absolutely. And finally, even something as simple as providing information about different climate solutions can subtly shift people's feelings of hope, which is a key driver for action.
So knowledge is power. Even just knowing that there are options out there can make a difference.
It can. It can help people feel like they're not just helpless in the face of this massive problem.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we wrap up here, here's something I want to leave you all with, something to kind of chew on. Given that hope seems to be such a critical factor in driving support for climate action, and it varies so widely across the globe, how can we foster what the study referred to as constructive hope? So that's hope that actually motivates meaningful action on climate change, without dismissing the very real concerns and negative emotions that many people understandably feel.
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
Yeah.
And how do these differing emotional landscapes across the world, how do those impact the way we collaborate on climate solutions on a global scale? It's a complex interplay of feelings and potential actions, and understanding those connections is going to be essential as we navigate the challenges of a changing climate.
It's not just about the science, it's about the human side of it as well.
Absolutely. All right, well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us, everyone. Hope it's given you some things to think about, some new perspectives. We'll be back soon with another exploration into the ideas and research that are shaping our world.
See you next time.